Today on Blue 58, there are lots of good reasons to think the Packers will be good this year. So, here's a question for you. What if everything goes well for the Packers in 2024?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode. A lot of stuff I want to get to today. A lot of sort of, meta Packers stuff today. Just been thinking about a lot of stuff as we go through training camp. We had family night this past Saturday. I don't want to go too deep into family night, but I do have a few observations from what I was able to see, and kudos on the Packers to making it available for people out of state legally for the first time. There were ways. There have always been ways to see family night if you wanted to, but I'm appreciative of the Packers for making them available, so saving you a couple steps, put it that way. We didn't see a lot from the Packers, but I think we can get some hints of what we're going to see on the field, and just some unusual things maybe that we're going to see out there, maybe stuff that they're just trying, and that's what training camp is for, in addition to figuring out who's going to make your football team. You just got to try some stuff here, and it looks like the Packers are making some attempts at some stuff on offense. First and foremost, if you look at their 11-on-11 stuff, that period of practice was dominated by a lot of tight and bunch formations for the offense. That is something that I like to see a lot for a couple different reasons. First, it puts the Packers right at the forefront of where the league trends are headed. You've seen a lot more of this kind of play over the past couple of years on the cutting edge offenses, and that puts the Packers right there with the other people who are pushing where offenses are going in the NFL as a whole. They're right with the leaders there, so that is good to see. There's a lot of good reasons to run these formations. They're difficult to defend, and they give you a lot of field to work with. It's it's oddly sort of related to spread philosophy. The whole idea of offense is that you want to put defenses into conflict. You want to make defenses have to think and sort through stuff while the offense is unfolding, while the plays are going forward. And the strengths of both like a bunched formation and a spread formation are similar in the ways that they put people into conflict, but they're also different in important ways too. In a spread offense, you create a lot of isolated one-on-one matchups. Think prime Mike McCarthy era Packers offensive football there. It's Aaron Rodgers operating in a shotgun, 11 personnel probably, but often 4 wide receivers beyond that. But people spread out all over the field, and Aaron Rodgers is going to pick and choose what he likes from his matchups there and try to exploit those matchups and get the ball down the field, often to explosive effect. Bunching up your offenses does the same sort of stuff, except you're putting defenses into very, very rapid conflict. In a spread situation, you often have the defensive backs or linebackers, whoever is covering your receivers, it's pretty easy for them to determine who they're going to be covering. In a bunch situation where you've got everybody packed in near the middle of the field, they are having the same sort of conflicts or the same sort of decisions. Everybody probably has a pretty good idea who they're going to be covering, except when you start mixing in motion and stuff like that. But at the snap, everybody's going to scatter. Instead of everybody kind of just going their own way in a spread formation, everybody's working off of each other within space, running these mesh concepts and complicated releases from stack and bunch formations. It's putting people in conflict in a similar way, but very different way from spread offenses. It also works really well for the Packers with the personnel that they have been trending toward. And I've got a piece in the works about this for thepowersweep.com. Kudos to Dusty Evely for helping me out with this one well in advance. I want to get that out there before we even write this post. But the Packers have been trending up over the past few years in their use of 12 personnel, trying to get multiple tight ends on the field. And if you don't think that's going to increase this year, I don't know what to tell you here, because they've got 2 tight ends that they really like at the top of their tight end depth chart right now, in Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. And wouldn't you know, the first play of this offensive 11-on-11 period, or one of the first plays, features 12 personnel, 2 tight ends in a tight formation. And you can just do so many things from that. If you really want a simple visual here of how this sort of thing can work, think of the conflict it creates in a really simple play. You see it in the Madden playbook. It's in the College Football 25 playbook too, if you're playing that game. But it's usually called something like bench. And you can run it from a bunch of different personnel groupings, but just let's imagine 11 personnel. You've got 2 wide receivers tight to the formation on the right side, and then a tight end and a wide receiver tight to the formation on the left side. Your 2 inside receivers, usually a tight end and a receiver, are going to go straight up the field or run almost like a little fade type of action, basically trying to hold the coverage that's in the center of the field as they go up the field. And then your 2 outside receivers are just going to run 2 outs. They call that bench for whatever reason, but maybe it looks like a bench, I don't know. But it's really easy to create conflict in those situations. And often on your 2 vertical routes, you'll have options for those guys where they can go inside, sort of bend it into a post, or go outside, bend it into a corner. And what they're actually reading is the outside or outside defensive back on that, usually the corner who's dropping back either into zone or staying short to cover the receiver running the out. You can see where the conflict arises, though. The cornerback has to decide, is he going to cover the short defender or go deep? The safeties have to decide, all right, how do we honor these 2 guys going deep while trying to figure out how we support other areas on the field? You can create a lot of conflict very easily in this sort of formation, and it's cool to see the Packers doing that. Secondly, we saw a couple of snaps with A.J. Dillon in kind of a wing back formation. Not quite an H-back, but definitely not sort of a typical running back sort of thing. That's something the Packers have hinted at before. We speculated that may not be entirely a good thing for Dillon or for whoever ends up in this sort of position switch sort of situation, but it was interesting to actually see it come to fruition. What does it mean? Maybe nothing, probably nothing, but as we always say in training camp, nothing is nothing. Speaking of little developments, we talked about Henry Pearson's departure and what that could mean for the Packers' quasi-fullback, H-back position. We did see a little Tyler Davis doing that sort of type stuff on at least one snap during family night. He ran an interesting sort of fullback lead sort of play, almost a split zone, in fact. Look, he started bunched up with a couple other receivers on the left side of the formation, motioned behind the line of scrimmage like he was running all the way across, and then at the snap did a little wind back block and actually ended up as a lead blocker to the left. That's some classic H-back, fullback Shanahan offense type stuff. You see that sort of thing a lot with the San Francisco 49ers, just different ways to run zone and lead plays. Of note that we saw Tyler Davis doing that. Does it mean anything in the grand scheme? Who knows? But they gave him a crack at it. On defense, not a lot of thoughts here, other than that it's jarring to see 7 in the box by default. The Packers were running a lot of base looks from what I was able to see in family night stuff, and that is a marked contrast to what we saw from Joe Barry. Joe Barry and kind of the version of the Fangio offense or the Fangio defense that he was running favored a lot of light boxes. You made up a lot of the numbers problems that you have in the box by only having really one linebacker out there a lot of the time, but having heavy fills from your safeties and your nickel and guys like that. In the Jeff Hafley base and a 4-3 base, you do not have that problem. You don't need to solve that because you got 4 down linemen and 3 linebackers behind them. Not always 3 linebackers, sometimes 2 linebackers and a safety. You get the gist here, though. You got beef in the box. You got a lot of guys up front, and that was interesting to see. It was like driving past your old neighborhood, and all the pieces are still the same. You still got Rashawn Gary up front. You still got Kenny Clark up front. Preston Smith is there, but it all looks a little bit different, and that was fun and jarring to see. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of that early in the season here, especially as they head toward preseason game number 1 here in just a couple of days. It's going to be interesting to see those sorts of things as the Packers figure out what it's like to be in this version of their defensive identity over the next few years. The second big thing I really wanted to talk about past family night was something I wrote about on Monday at thepowersweep.com about Jordan Morgan playing guard. And I want to pull on that thread a little bit more today. The Packers released their first depth chart, and it features Jordan Morgan as their starting right guard. I've written a lot about Morgan over the past couple of weeks at thepowersweep.com, just talking about his role with the Packers, how he ended up there. And the thing that I landed on is that it's funny, it's odd. It's an odd situation for Morgan to be in here, and for the Packers, really. When you think about it, on both an individual and a collective level, put it that way, a contextual level. Morgan is in the interesting spot of being a first-round pick who's really only ever played one position dating back to high school, and now is in the position of being, well, in a different position. He's been basically penciled in as the starting left tackle for every team he's played for since he was a teenager, and now he's got to switch positions now. Even though he was a first-round pick, even though he's a premium athlete, the Packers say, no thanks, we're all set basically at tackle, even though we picked you a tackle. Now we're going to put you at guard. And then it's funny that the reason that he's at guard and who he's competed with at guard too. Normally you would think in a vacuum, a third-year, third-round pick who has started games for you or played fairly significant snaps for you at that position in the past would be basically a heavy incumbent at that position. But that's not the case with Sean Rhyan. His career has really gotten off to an unusual and, well, bad start in a lot of ways. And here's Morgan competing with him, playing out of position himself, trying to figure out who's the starting guard. And why are both of them really only guard prospects besides, or even though that they were tackles in college? Ryan did a little bit of guard stuff in college too. But, they came in as potential swing guard tackle sort of players. They're both playing guard because, like I said, the Packers said we're all set at tackle. We've got Rasheed Walker, a former 7th-round pick, and Zach Tom, a former 4th-round pick. 2 day 3 guys just manning their tackle spots, and they're like, yep, that's good enough. We're all set. And they are right to do so because both Walker and Tom have been real good in the opportunities that they've had. But the rub, and this is really where I spend the bulk of the piece here, is that none of it matters if Jordan Morgan is good. And this really gets to something that I've been thinking about a lot more and working through as sort of part of my football thinking tool set over the past couple of years. This idea of positional value and stuff like that. Not really stuff like it, but just stuff related to it when you build rosters. Roster building is one of my favorite things about covering this team, covering the Packers. You see how the team comes together. You see how they're spending resources and stuff like that. And one of the big conventions, especially among more analytically minded people in roster building discussions, is this idea of positional value. Like you want to be spending resources on your premium positions and making sure that you've got your best players playing those spots. And traditionally, your thinking is, quarterbacks and edge rushers and offensive tackles and cornerbacks are near the top of your positional value, maybe wide receivers somewhere after that, and safeties, then maybe interior linemen, defensive linemen in there somewhere as well, probably a little bit higher up than I've listed them. And then toward the bottom is going to be your linebackers and your very interior linemen, your centers and your guards. I don't think there's a lot to argue with there in a vacuum, but I think it becomes a problem when you start to really force that thinking onto the NFL draft. And really the reason for that is the draft is just such a crapshoot. It'd be great if you could always target the positional values or the positions that are most valuable. But the big problem here is nobody is good enough at the draft to really just focus on trying to take the most valuable positions. You really just got to focus on getting good players. And as it pertains to Jordan Morgan, if he turns out to be a good guard and is a good guard for as long as they need him to play guard and maybe switches to tackle eventually, or maybe never plays tackle and is a guard forever, if he ends up being a good guard for the Packers for 6, 8, 10, 12 years, that is a win of a pick, regardless of the positional value. Because more than positional value, you just need good players on the field. And the Packers, by playing Morgan at guard, are taking care of one of the best things that you can do on your football team and eliminating weak links. When we talk about positional value, and Paul Noonan of Acme Packing Company has done some great work on this, but when you talk about positional value, you're really forgetting one of the key things about football. When you put your 11 guys on the field for offense or especially defense, the most valuable players are often not the most important, especially when you look at defense. And I think offensive line is really closely related to this because who gets picked on in those situations? Who does the opposing team attack, either when you're trying to find weak spots in your offense or your defense? Well, they don't go after your good players. They go after your bad ones. So positional value really doesn't align always with football strategy. Now, to be fair, there are some pros to positional value. Of course, you want to make sure that you take care of those important positions. But just getting good players, I think, is even more important than that. And so if Morgan ends up being good at guard, there's really nothing to wring your hands over here. Even if they'd prefer that he plays tackle long term or prefer that he works out so that he can use his best attributes at the more important position, that would be great. But if all he ever is a really good guard, you've still done pretty well for yourself. I think the Indianapolis Colts are pretty happy with Quentin Nelson from a few years ago. He's been exactly as advertised from the get-go, a really, really, really good guard. That's 20% of your offensive line sorted for a decade. That's not too shabby. That's a considerable benefit to your team. And the more good players that you can collect, the less it matters really what positions they play as you just get them on the field. The stronger your overall team is matters more than the individual value of where you got those guys. Just get the good guys wherever you get them and put them on the field however you can. And I think most of the rest is going to take care of itself. It's all really going to work out. And there's a transition for you. Harkening back to the intro here. What if everything works out? I've been a little bit introspective today. It's August 6th, which means that it's my birthday. I'm 36 years old today. Getting old. By some measures into the back half here. And I am not a big fan of birthdays because it feels like you have pressure to have a good time. And I like having fun as much as the next guy. What I don't like to do is waking up in the morning and people being like, what are you going to do that's fun today? I don't know. That's a lot of pressure. I got to find out something fun to do by myself or, make sure that everybody else has fun too because of the way that I'm made and put together and stuff like that. But in the midst of that, perhaps sometimes melancholic thinking that I am prone to. There's one of my birthday goals, trying to get away from some of the more dour aspects of my personality here. Thinking about that sort of maybe memento mori sort of stuff, the doom and gloom thinking that I am prone to on my birthday. I think back a lot to this bumper sticker that I saw recently that just said, what if everything works out? And that it's just so contrary to how I am as a person a lot of the times. Because a lot of times I'm not focusing on what's going to happen if things work out. I'm focusing on how things can go badly. And God knows I've brought that up enough in training camp stuff, talking about, how we're looking at this roster and thinking about how, we're just waiting to see what happens injury-wise, what's going to go bad, what's going to happen once things start to go a little bit out of sync. But what if everything goes well for the Packers? What if everything works out? That's kind of been the theme so far for training camp. Is everything working out? Everything has gone well for the Packers in training camp to this point. Aside from the increasingly minor, in retrospect, hiccup of Jordan Love not having his contract done to start training camp, everything has gone according to plan. Jordan Love and the offense have looked increasingly sharp the longer that he's been involved. The wide receivers look deep and talented as we expected. The offensive line looks talented and versatile like we expected. Interesting things are happening on defense, though you can never really tell how the defense is doing until things are for real. That's not news to anybody, but things are going well. I've argued consistently that things can't and won't continue that way. And they won't. Something's going to go wrong at some point here, and that's when things really get interesting. But what if things just go well for the Packers this year? What's the season going to look like if things just go as expected for the Packers? So, thinking about that context, thinking about all of these sorts of things, what if things go well for the Packers this year? What does all of that look like? What does a good season for the Packers look like? I thought we should talk about expectations and predictions at the team level to round out this podcast today. Usually I do this at the end of training camp, but it feels like now is a good time to talk about that. So, just to start, expectations on a lot of individual player levels are high, at the coaching level is high, and I think as this team as a whole comes together, it's fair to say that the expectations are high for this year's Packers team. It really goes without saying, I think, but let's outline why that is. First and foremost, I think this is easy to forget, but the Packers were in a rebuilding year last year, reloading year, restructuring, reconfiguring, whatever. That process is ahead of schedule. All the young players that the Packers needed to play bigger roles than expected last year blossomed fairly early. The receiving core is awash with talent in large part because of that. We're not wondering what Jayden Reed and Dontavian Wicks and all those guys can do this year because they did so much of it last year. Jordan Love, I think, similarly is ahead of schedule too. The Packers also got a lot of fiscal solvency earlier than expected due to some enormous cap growth. If you read a lot of the stuff that was happening about this time in 2023, or maybe even a little bit earlier, a lot of the cap watchers in Green Bay were expecting this to be another take your medicine sort of year as the Packers shed a lot of the weight from the late Rodgers era that was on their cap. So you're thinking David Bakhtiari, Devondre Campbell, ended up being guys like Aaron Jones. They needed to take a pretty big hit on those things in 2024. If not for some bigger than expected cap growth, that would have been a problem for this year as well. You would have had to deal with a lot of that, and the Packers just didn't, so they could go out and sign both Xavier McKinney and Josh Jacobs and extend Kenny Clark and extend Jordan Love and still have a whole bunch of money left over, which I would guess probably gets rolled over into next year because the cupboard's pretty bare in terms of shopping right now, and unless they had a big contract at the deadline, I don't see a lot of stuff that the Packers really have to do. So they're ahead of schedule in a lot of ways. Secondly, they overachieved last year. The ending was disappointing. Let one get away against the 49ers. When has that ever happened before? But worth remembering that we were looking at, 2-5 at one point last year? What was it? It was not good at about 7-8 game mark last year. Things were not going well. But then things started to go well, and then they went really well, and then we destroyed the Dallas Cowboys, and suddenly you're in the divisional round of the playoffs wondering, how did this happen when you weren't even expecting to get to the playoffs really at all this year? Though, I will point out, there were some podcasters that you are currently listening to right now that actually predicted the Packers would make the playoffs last year. That was part of the reason the first half of the season ended up being so disappointing, but because I actually I had a lot riding on that, but I said it was likely that they could make the playoffs because the NFC North was wide open and predicted that last year. But even if they did overachieve last year, even if I expected to make them to make the playoffs last year, what they did in the playoffs, beating the Cowboys, taking the 49ers to the wire, exceeded expectations. That seems fair. They overachieved last year, and that raises the bar downstream, and here we are downstream of that. Third, they've got basically everything they could have wanted right now. Short of maybe, in an ideal situation here, a couple of things would have gone differently, 2021 to present. You probably get things sorted out with Davante Adams. That does not seem... Everything that has come out subsequent to Davante Adams leaving the Green Bay Packers suggests the Packers did not do a good job of managing that relationship. I think you can go back and forth on whether or not signing him was a good idea. I think it is. I think he has the sort of game that would have aged well, and I think Jordan Love certainly would have benefited from having a guy like him, and you could have had a lot of the resources that you got in the Aaron Rodgers trade married with Davante Adams. That seems like a win to me, but that's water under the bridge. But short of that, and short of David Bakhtiari not tearing his ACL in 2020 and probably aging into a third contract as well, or a fourth contract as well, or working out his contract so that he's still probably around too. Short of that, you've got basically everything you could have hoped for. Brian Gutekunst got to have it both ways with Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. He got a couple of great years out of Rodgers, then still got draft capital for him, and look, they've come out the other side in good cap space situation going forward. Matt LaFleur is everything the Packers could have hoped for after they hired him in 2019. Jordan Love is paying off their big bet. They got the defensive coordinator they wanted. All of their young players are coming together at the same time. This is the best case scenario, basically, of what you could have hoped for when things are... Look to the end of the 2022 season. Let's just rewind to there. The Packers lose to the Detroit Lions with the playoffs on the line at Lambeau Field. That's probably the low point of the Matt LaFleur era in Green Bay. And now here we are, less than 2 years later on the calendar, and the Packers are being touted as Super Bowl contenders. This is everything you could have wanted from then to now. This is what you hope for, and the Packers have it. So expectations are high. What are the predictions for this year? I think it's 12 years or more in terms of wins. That's both a prediction and an expectation here. That's I think the expected level for the Packers. I thought about making it 11. I think 12-5 is the minimum for this year's team. Counting losses, I don't see a ton on the schedule this year. Even if you split with the NFC North, go 3-3 in the North, that's still 2 more games you can drop outside your division, which seems fairly reasonable. Maybe one other one that you get bit 1 week by something unexpected. Jordan Love gets hit by a bus. I don't know. But I think 12-5 is a reasonable starting point for this team for this year. I think they should also have a top 5 scoring offense this year. That should be a walk in the park. They have the talent to do that. They compete in a division that's not overly strong defensively. I think the Bears were good down the stretch, but there's some fool's gold there too. Look at the quarterbacks they played. I think the Lions are always going to be a little bit hit and miss defensively just because of their identity. And the Vikings, I think, are a little bit of the same there too. They're still in a little bit of a retooling phase, though I think they'll be better than last year. Just looking at who the Packers are going to play the most often, they have a good chance to put up some good numbers scoring-wise here. I think they're also going to have a top 10 scoring defense here. As well, let's throw out just all the defensive predictions right here, right now. Top 10 scoring defense, top half in rushing defense, top 10 by passing defense by volume, so just the traditional passing metric score, how many yards are they giving up, and then a top 12 passing defense by Pro Football Focus grade. All of those kind of grouped together, basically, I mean, when you start throwing out top 10 type stuff, that makes the defense sound really, really good. And compared to what they've been the last few years, that is really good. But saying top 10 is a lot like what we talked about with Jordan Love last year. Getting into the top 10 when there's only 32 of something is not actually super duper impressive. It really just means you're in the top third. Being a top 10 quarterback sounds good, but if you're 8, 9, 10 there, you're closer to the halfway point than you are to the top. So there's still I think will be room to grow as Hafley implements his system here, but I do expect them to take some big steps forward from where they were last year. I think they're going to get more out of the talent that they have than they have in recent years. I think we're going to see a big increase in takeaways. I don't even know what the number was last year, but they're going to have more takeaways than they did last year, and ball hawks will also increase on defense as well. Circling back to offense, I think the explosive plays are going to go up as well. In fact, I think they're going to have the most explosive plays of the Matt LaFleur era here. Again, that's not that big of an increase. Explosive plays have been more consistent than enormous under Matt LaFleur. The year-to-year variation hasn't been that much. In fact, looking back to 2019, they were I think they were actually identical to where they were in the last year of the Mike McCarthy era. They've never just put up tons and tons of them in bunches, but Aaron Rodgers played a different style of offense than they're playing now, and I think they're going to have a chance to unlock more explosive plays than they have in recent years. So I think we're going to see the most out of the Matt LaFleur era this season. I'm not going to predict that they win the NFC North. I think that's more certainty than I'm willing to give this team. I do think it's going to be a rock fight in the NFC North this year, and 12-5 is my prediction for the Packers at least this year. But if they were below that, I would not be surprised just because of how tricky the NFC North could be this year. But I will predict that they make the playoffs, and I predict that they will at least advance to the divisional round of the playoffs. Why these predictions specifically, though? Basically, when I'm thinking about this year's team, it basically comes down to that divisional round prediction. The divisional round, I think, is the measuring stick for overall team success for a year. Well, a lot of people want to say, win the Super Bowl and you have a successful season, don't win and you don't. There are some years where I think Super Bowl is the expectation. There have been a couple of them in the recent recent history of the Packers. 2020 was a good example of that. 2021, I think, was a good example of that. But by and large, I think most of the time the divisional round is a good barometer for being something as a team. Put it that way. Getting to the divisional round puts you in the top quarter of the league. You're one of the final 8 teams standing, and I think that's a good expectation for the Packers this year, at least in the top quarter of the NFL. Beyond that, your success is going to come down largely to matchups. This is not something that people want to hear a lot in the have a take industry. Zach Rappaport of the Unpack podcast would say the people trying to win the race to the top of Take Mountain. But when it comes down to it, I think a lot of playoff football just comes down to matchups. And if you're trying to make this big point about Aaron Rodgers being a choker or the Packers wasting Aaron Rodgers' prime or this, that, or the other thing about who's the best and who's the worst and all of those things, matchups have a big part in your postseason success. And a big part of the failures of the Rodgers era came down to matchups. In 2011, just for instance, the Packers played – people don't like to hear this one either. They want to label Rodgers a choker or Mike McCarthy a choker or whatever. But the Giants were a uniquely bad matchup for the 2011 Packers, in addition to the Packers picking that time to play their very worst game of the entire season. Sometimes you just don't play well, and sometimes you don't play well on a week where you happen to be playing a team that is uniquely structured to beat you. The Giants matched up really well in 2011 with 2 teams, the Green Bay Packers and the New England Patriots. And wouldn't you know it, they ended up beating both of them en route to Eli Manning's second Super Bowl. But that happened to the Packers a few times. In 2016, the Packers were not a great team, but if they got better matchups in the NFC Championship game, just for instance, there's a good chance they're off to the Super Bowl. But they just happened to be playing a team that was well coached and well structured in a way that was going to take advantage of a team that needed to play a shootout and stumbled a little bit on offense because they were down a significant weapon in Jordy Nelson that game, who was playing with broken ribs and playing against the offensive buzzsaw that was the Falcons that year. That was a bad matchup for the Packers. But the point is, you get to the divisional round, you get some good matchups, anything can happen. And I think getting to that divisional round is the baseline measure for a good team. The Packers, I think, are a good team. We should expect them to at least get to the second round of the playoffs, and if they don't, I think this year is a failure. Beyond that, once you're there, it's going to be matchups and opportunities. Sometimes you get an opportunity against a team that's really well suited for you. Play it in reverse. Let's talk about the 2010 Packers against the 2010 Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons probably thought they matched up pretty well for the Packers that year, given that they handled the Packers in the regular season. But that particular day, that was not a good matchup for the Atlanta Falcons, as a lot of people found out in the Georgia Dome that day. That is the ideal scenario there. Sometimes it's going to be somewhere in between that. You play a really tough game that ends up being close, and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Maybe you have a 4th and 26 situation or something like that. But getting to that divisional round, I think, should be the goal. That's the baseline for a good team. And I think that's what we want to see from the Packers this year. That's what I'm expecting. That's what I'm hoping to see. And that's what I think the Packers can do. And that's all I've got for you on this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.